Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nik Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university. Hey, Nik. Here we are doing a breaking news episode. How do you feel about that?
You dragged me out of summer vacation for this. It better be good.
I thought every moment we spent together was like a vacation. That's what you told me. Anyway. No, we're here with a special episode about this stuff about AI and entry-level jobs that's sort of in the ether. As academics, we're the most comfortable writing laborious essays about events that happened years ago and waiting years for them to be published. For instance, I contributed to an edited volume on the 2022 midterms that was just published in spring 25. Perfect timing. We are breaking that time-honored tradition and talking about a raft of recent articles about AI and jobs. Nik, let's run through some highlights.
All right. So Kevin Roose in the New York Times published a piece really recently, and I'm just going to read a little bit from that. He says, this month, millions of young people will graduate from college and look for work in industries that have little use for their skills, view them as expensive and expendable, and are rapidly phasing out their jobs in favor of artificial intelligence. That is the troubling conclusion of my conversations over the past several months with economists, corporate executives, and young job seekers, many of whom pointed to an emerging crisis for entry-level workers that appears to be fueled, at least in part, by rapid advances in AI capabilities.
And that article was not an isolated incident. There's actually a whole series on Axios right now, but I'm going to highlight a direct quote from a recent piece from Jim Vanderhee and Mike Allen. Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, one of the world's most powerful creators of artificial intelligence, has a blunt, scary warning for the US government and all of us. AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. Amodei told us in an interview from his San Francisco office. Amodei said, AI companies and governments need to stop sugarcoating what's coming. The possible mass elimination of jobs across technology, finance, law, consulting, and other white-collar professions, especially entry-level gigs. So, like I said, this is part of a whole series of articles that are out in the ether. Nik, we both listened to the recent Hard Fork episode where Roose and Casey Newton broke down some of these reporting. And it provides a more nuanced take than I think the articles do. I definitely would recommend that to listeners.
Definitely. But one thing as we're listening to that and then we're reading these pieces, I think we both dropped what we were doing and we're like, hey, has big implications for higher ed, because obviously where are these white collar jobs? Who's training them? And it's the universities of all different kinds. So I think, I think we want to kind of break down and kind of get into some of that nuance and some of the ramifications for higher ed. What did you take out of Hard Fork, that episode that you mentioned, that really kind of, added to these pieces that are a little bit more that stark viewpoint?
Well, the first thing that I took away is something that's absent, and it's what you just highlighted, which is the implications that these trends might have on higher education, which, like you said, is one of the reasons why we're talking about this. But another thing that they pointed out is that there's lots of noise in the economic data right now, right? There's changing interest rates, tariffs. There are lots of things that make it easy to sort of look past some of these employment numbers and think, there's a lot going on right now. But one of the things that they pointed out, and this may have been in Bruce's article as well, is that currently the unemployment rate for recent college grads is actually higher than the general unemployment rate.
Yeah, that stood out to me.
And that is just so unusual. I'm not an economist. I don't spend a lot of time looking at the crosstabs of job numbers, but that's what really popped to me and made me think about our roles as educators.
Yeah, that absolutely stood out to me. One thing that I think that the Axios piece and Roose and Newton talked about that really kind of troubles me is that the executives at these AI companies are being pretty explicit that one of their goals is to actually replace jobs and to disrupt, white collar work with these tools. It's like sometimes an explicit goal of theirs, or at least not something that they're trying to hide or shy away from. To me, that really signals something different where, in other epochs, it might be like, oops, we broke something, that's just the consequence here. But to intentionally kind of start out with this new technology, aiming for particular sectors, kind of, I don't want to speculate too much, but it kind of means there's some guiding principle or value or goal that they're trying to get to with these technologies, not just to dazzle us with them.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well. One of the things that they talked about on Hard Fork was that they're not running up against a technical limitation right now. It's just a where do they want their focus to be? And you can just imagine them saying like, okay, this week we're doing all accounting work.
Hmm.
And then next week we're doing all marketing. It seems so methodical. And I agree with you. For a long time, we've had these sort of vague statements from people in the labs. Oh, it's an uncertain future. Sam Altman will write one of those like stupid blog posts where he's like, crazy stuff going on in the world of AI.
Yeah.
And I know you and I, every time he does that, we're like, yeah, we know you're the one doing all the stuff.
Yeah. Right.
But now it's just like, oh no, we're just going to go one job sector at a time.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like think about the art and the video capabilities now. I mean, nobody was really asking, "Hey, can you just make us a virtual artist or a virtual cinematographer?" And because that's what we really need in this world. And I know they're kind of high on their own supply, and they're like, "Look what we can do," and it's kind of showing off, and it's incredible. Like the stuff they're doing really does blow the mind, and especially like in the advances over the last 3 years. But I do think there is that sort of we know what we got here and we know how it can disrupt everything from art to film to data entry. And they're kind of going for it. So that stood out to me. And as I listened to Hard Fork, I kept thinking about something you and I talked about once around, universities, the modern higher education really kind of blossoms in the 60s and 70s, right at the time where our economy went through a huge labor shift with deindustrialization and then eventually outsourcing and sort of the professionalization of work across the country and all over the world. And it kind of had like a 40, 50-year reign where professional white collar jobs were the best jobs, the most powerful jobs, the most valued and sought after jobs. And I think one of the implications here that's really out of our control in some ways is that we're kind of we're at the maybe at the leading edge of a deprofessionalization process where those privileges, those powers, those roles and salaries that came with professionalization might start being chipped away. And I think that has huge implications for the industry, like higher education, which is the industry that trains all of those people, right? And gave that social political power to them.
That's absolutely so well said, Nick. And the future is uncertain. You found an interesting counterpoint to this sort of apocalyptic vision of deprofessionalization and job loss. Do you want to give voice to that really quick before we move on?
Yeah. So, while I was listening to Hard Fork and these other sources, there was something in the back of my mind that was not jiving with me. I felt like there at this stage, there still is a big leap from having, an AI model, LLM, get you a spreadsheet or a chart or do some of that white collar work. But it hasn't actually shown that it's capable of doing the actual job, the salaried job, in all that entails with a 365, position over the course of a year. And so there was something about back of my mind. And I recently came across a Benedict Evans uh, post on Threads. He's a longtime, observer and thinker on technology. I just want to quickly read that one. He posted, he said, the idea that AI will wipe out large categories of white collar work seems to overlap quite a lot with the idea that much of professional services, lawyers, bankers, analysts, consultants, consist of idiots doing something really easy, which in turn is mostly held by people with no experience in those fields. First, a lot of this is harder to automate than it looks. And second, why did Excel, which is an interesting historical point here, why did Excel produce more employment in finance and not less? He goes on to say automation, and I'm going to side bracket this here. We get to talk about Jevons paradox again.
It's a repeat offender on Unfixed.
And indeed, the Jevons paradox often comes down to price elasticity. If it becomes cheaper and easier to do a thing, do you do the same work with fewer people? Or do you do more work with the same people? Or indeed more work with more people, right? It depends, he says.
Nick, I love that as a counterbalance to some of the doom and gloom, especially because it's historically grounded. I'm so glad you found that. I feel like with those sort of pieces set up, now we're positioned to have a conversation about the higher education connections. And if you, our beloved listener, has not figured this out yet, this one's a little bit less scripted than what Nick and I usually do. And it's because this is breaking news. And while I'm not mistaking Nick for Walter Cronkite anytime soon, I am interested in getting this out the door and responding in real time. So we have some higher ed connections laid out here. And the first one, and this occurred to me when I was listening to Hard Fork, is I was thinking, oh, what are the implications for higher education? And well, a student who's thinking about whether or not to go to college, they're going to be entering the labor force as an entry level white collar worker 4, 5, 6 years from now. And then I was thinking, that's so stupid, Zach, because it's not like 19-year-olds are poring over the crosstabs of jobs reports looking for anomalies and then making life decisions based on those things. They're making decisions based on, oh, this place is local and inexpensive, or they have the thing that I want to study, or my girlfriend goes here, or whatever it is. But the one thing I will say is this stuff's in the air,
Hmm.
right? It's you don't have to be waist deep in labor statistics for there to be an awareness that the labor market is shifting.
Hmm.
And it's not like I think that 18-year-olds are regular readers of Axios or listeners to Hard Fork by and large part, but that's not the only way people get news.
Yeah, we probably should have scanned TikTok first, but we didn't. But but like anything in today's society, narratives like this will circulate. All it takes is someone's mom or dad reading one of those or listening to the thing or seeing it on the news, and they forward it to their son or daughter at university, who then like says something to somebody else. I mean, that's how a lot of us digest our news. It's little bits pass through our little social networks. But so I think that's a good point. And on that vein, the public perception of the value of university and the university degree, I think, is also another um, consequence point, or at least an area that could be impacted, kind of building from what you were just talking about. As people hear these stories or imagine that these futures, because let's just be realistic, what the CEOs of these companies and the economists, they're telling a story about the future. They don't know what the future is going to be. Nobody does. But they're telling us a story. And now it might be grounded in what they know materially about the models and so on and so forth and what's coming next. But they enter, as we just talked about, the public arena and through social media and personal, connections. And I think that there's a danger that those stories will begin to also chip away at the value perception of universities. And that's already dangerous because we already know the value, the perception of the value of university has already been going down, not just as a perception, but also the fact that fewer people are going, and all of the sort of attacks, both from the left and right, on universities themselves. So I think that's an area that I'm concerned about, right? As just another pile-on to the some of the misery that universities are already currently experiencing.
Yeah, I am too. I have a real specific example of this. So when I was department chair and program coordinator, one of the things that I did is I would go to community colleges, talk to classes, talk to
Mm,
groups whenever I could to try and convince people to come to Chico State, enroll in communication studies, that kind of stuff. The far and away the most impactful things that I would show people would be a chart that projects lifetime earnings of somebody with an associate's degree versus a bachelor's degree.
mhm.
And, you know, where do we place the value of higher education if that chart looks really different in a couple of years in terms of the job prospects? Or, if these Amodei particularly is really focused on these entry level jobs. So, like, is it an attractive pitch if we're talking to 19-year-olds and trying to trying to prosecute the value of higher education to say, well, your first 5 years out the gate are going to be really rough. And unemployment's going to be uncertain. You're probably living with your parents, but after that, things trend in the right direction, right? Like that's not an
That's
attractive pitch.
that's not a good story. And that actually made me remember that one of the best conversations that they had on the Hard Fork podcast was around, we're talking about entry level. So we're talking about those first jobs that people get out of college. And we think of those as, oh, those are just easy, simple jobs, that the corporate structure or the NGO or whoever you're working for just makes you do a bunch of busy work. But what Casey Newton in particular, really emphasized that without his entry level jobs as a reporter doing like the most basic things, he would never have gotten to where he is now, which is an accomplished technology writer, thinker, right, and podcaster. It's not that you just go from, oh, I get a college degree and then I could become Casey Newton without having to go through all the entry level. And so that's one danger there. The other story I wanted to really quickly tell is that I used to do those, Choose Chico events where all the faculty gather and then the parade of family members, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, and students come through and they're trying to decide, should they come to Chico State? And one of the reasons I actually stopped doing them because I kind of got tired of basically I was like, what's sociology? I have to explain it. And they'd be like, I don't understand what any of that is. That doesn't sound that interesting. Fine, I can deal with that. The other one was, well, what could my son or daughter do with this when they graduate? What's the job prospect? And I know people on the inside and at the university, we want to see ourselves as we're developing really strong, capable, well-rounded human beings. But when you talk to the families, they're sending their kids off to become, workers, to get jobs, to have a livelihood, to have a career. And I think that's important to remember too in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're shopping for what kind of retirement home is the career of my son or daughter going to buy me
Right.
access to, right? Um, So the other connection to higher ed, and this is something that you will read, Nick and I write about a lot, as well as something that'll be a regular fixture on this podcast, has to do with the pace of change on campuses, and especially at collective bargaining, shared governance environments. We are not exactly famed for our agility in the face of crisis, right? And so if this moment requires us to pivot, not just how we're teaching, but what we're teaching, I think it's an open question about whether or not we are positioned to meet that challenge. And I don't want
Mhm.
to belabor that point. Nick and I have a whole podcast coming up on that particular issue. But this does highlight a particular urgency because of the close connection between the college education and entry level jobs. And I'm just not sure that we're in the right spot to meet that challenge.
Yeah, totally. Um, yeah, so I think we'll save those deeper conversations on that point for our episode coming forward. So check it out. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that one. All right. So the last one I wanted to talk about here before we kind of move on to like, well, what should we do in higher ed? What should leaders be doing is, if we go back to the 1960s and the sort of birth of the modern version of higher education, we could kind of put it in there, the rise and dominance of the land grant universities and then the public model like Chico State and the CSU system itself. And, I think it's pretty clear that that growth and power and development of public universities across the country was predicated on the growth of the sort of information capitalism that began to crystallize, after World War II, but certainly in the 60s, 70s, and then onward with computerization and the internet. And so I think, the modern university, higher education, if it was partly there to serve the needs of a particular form or historical form of capitalism, and the kind of jobs that businesses wanted and needed, literate, computer literate, people could write and all that kind of stuff. If that's declining, I think it suggests that the university to be viable going forward is going to have to pivot, right? It's going to have to pivot, and it kind of calls into the question that what we're going to talk about in other episodes, really about what is the sort of existential crisis of the university and the sort of all these pressures piling in at one time. And I think this new jobs report or this new jobs idea is just another one of those crises points that could could really be difficult for universities to navigate, but of course, very important for them to do so.
And speaking of how they're going to navigate it, that cues us up perfectly for our third segment, which is what higher ed leaders should be doing. Nick, that was beautiful. Are you a professional podcaster? And you've
Oh,
been
yeah,
able to
after
handle?
3 episodes, I
Uh,
definitely, as an
y-
academic, I would say, yes, I'm a professional now.
yes, 100%.
Just joking.
Okay, so we do want to talk a little bit about if you're a higher ed leader at an institution, a system, a think tank, what it is that you should be doing. And I want to start off this segment by making a particular point because one of the areas where the broader discourse about AI and jobs disconnects from higher education is in the sort of growth camp. And so let me back up. When people are talking about AI and job disruption, they tend to fall into two different categories. There's either the sort of efficiency grouping where we will use AI to replace jobs. So before you had four people writing content for your social media feeds, now you have one person that's managing a couple of AI agents and generation. So then you've replaced three jobs with one person that's using AI. So that's a sort of efficient replacement model. And the other camp is growth. And this is the more optimistic camp. And this is the one where, I think most people gravitate towards because it's not as catastrophic. And that's the idea that AI will make us more productive, but then what we will do with that increased capacity is produce more stuff,
Mm.
more computer code, more writing, more material goods. And there's strong evidence that then that's what we tend to do. That I don't want to speculate too much about human nature, but that seems to be what we do when we have more capacity, right? Like we have
Yep.
the programmable loom. Now I have 15 shirts instead of owning one shirt,
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
Hmm.
The problem is for us in higher education, growth doesn't look the same
Yeah.
because who we're helping are students, and there are only so many students.
Hmm.
So if our capacity increases and we can do more stuff, where is our growth? Unless we're going to look at a different sector like universities becoming education hubs, not just for 18 to 25-year-olds, but also a sort of like ongoing lifetime education model where businesses are turning to us rather than in-house training or like Deloitte or something like that to do professional development as people go on, right? Like that's an area that we could grow into with these sort of efficiency gains. But growth for us looks really different than it did if we were at a software company.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point that really maps onto the sort of demographic problems that universities are facing is that unlike, the lumber industry or whatever is like, hey, there's another forest. Let's just keep finding the forest. And certainly they'll eventually run out of them and they'll have to do technological substitutions and so on and so forth. But when you have essentially a finite pool of people, which we do, that can and want to go to university, there's only so much you can kind of convince them, and then eventually there's a hard limit on that. So that's going to be a real challenge there. I like that. I think that's an interesting idea about retraining. In my program, we have our distance online education program. And that's what a lot of what we do. We serve, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds coming, getting their college degree for the first time to get new skills, new training, to get a new job, to get a promotion, to do that kind of stuff. So I think that is an area where you can grow. And that's what we've been doing in our department. That's how we've been able to remain viable, to become a growing program, is because we tapped into that re-education, or not re-education, it sounds like some kind of, North Korean thing,
Not
but
great, Nick. Not great.
the kind of like retraining, reskilling of older people.
You should offer a weekend getaway and maybe call it like a re-education camp.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
so, okay, but what else should we be doing? Well, of course, there's more conversations to be have. And do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gotten kind of lazy about this in higher education, less so in the last couple of years, but for most of our history, we have just assumed that the value in what we're doing is obvious
Hmm. Yeah.
and then relied on people to come to us rather than us going to them. And as competition has ramped up, especially in the post-COVID era, there's been more articulation of that, but we we can't just assume that everyone knows we're awesome and then they're going to send their students to us. That's
Hmm.
just that we just that's less true now than it was 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. And for, another one that we had kind of discussed a little bit about was is that there's a big, I wouldn't say big, there's a schism within faculty and administrators around what is the ultimate purpose of higher education? Is it job training? And we do a lot on our campuses, especially at public universities, to gear what we do as job training, right? We may not think of it that way. It's not like a auto body shop or something like that. But, we're thinking, students need to do X, Y, and Z because that's what the jobs require. So, but of course, going back to education, historically, it's the other side has always been thinking about it as, creating well-rounded, you know, Leonardo da Vinci's or something, right? That you're just kind of becoming a better person. And in a democratic society, that was always tied to the idea that you're going to become a better citizen who can engage in democratic, politics. And so I think this reanimates that because I think there's one wing that'll look at this crisis with the jobs, or Liz, whether it's real or not, and say, you know what, we need to double, triple down on retooling university as a career and job training institution. And I think you'll have another side of people who will look at this and say, you know what, we've been right all along. We need to cut the jobs part out and really emphasize a different set of values, sort of more, values along the lines of things that make human beings better, better able to navigate the world, more knowledgeable, because those things are intrinsically good, right? So I think this is just going to sort of, accentuate those dividing lines already in what the university is supposed to be.
So that brings us to a different issue, Nick, which is how many conversations have you had about this with colleagues or seen academic leaders with discourse about this in higher ed periodicals or online?
Very few, very few.
Yeah, I've been a little bit distressed at the lack of traction that this has gotten in higher ed because the implications to me seem patently obvious and potentially catastrophic.
Yeah.
And at the very least, we've got to engage in that conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, we talked before the episode. It's like, we were talking about leadership. Like, what does leadership look like? And I don't think right now we're not seeing that, right? In any of the AI space, I think it's been lackluster in some universities, and certainly there's people on campuses being leaders and doing that kind of stuff, but not at the way that I think these reports suggest that we should be moving with clarity, with, collaboration, cohesion. But that all has to start with taking this seriously at the institutional level. And I think we have an episode coming up on this topic, which we'll get more into it. But I think that's been lacking that that parallel that we've made in our writing around COVID, even where we saw what that looks like, that rapid response, and it can be done. I don't know what, Zach, you're more plugged into some of this stuff, but what's preventing this from gaining that traction narratively, if not even, of course, structurally?
Well, I think part of it is the pace of change. Part of it is something that we've written about earlier, which is that there are a sort of network of crises that are confronting a lot of higher education institutions right now. Enrollments, budget, changes in federal policy, which are imperiling funding streams, that sort of thing. And so I think it's easy for this to get lost, especially because there's not great understanding about the technology, its implications for higher ed. But here's my call to that. Let's say you read those articles that Nick and I cited early on with warranted skepticism, and read what Dario Amodei said about the possible wipeout of 50% of entry-level white-collar jobs, and you think that doesn't seem very likely. Okay, sure, I'll grant you that. Let's say that there is a 1 in 3 chance that that is true. That's also basically a 1 in 3 chance that a significant number of higher ed institutions have to shutter their doors in the next 10 years. And I think if we were facing a 1 in 3 risk of that from something that we understood a little bit better, we would be in conference rooms and in conversation trying to solve that problem night and day.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintoair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintoair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nick Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintoair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.